Well, it's great to be with you again, Katina Michael, your instructor for Public Interest Technology Principles 501. And today I want to spend a little bit of time on the classic text by Sid Harrell, a UX designer who did work for Code for America for some time. And her book is titled A Civic Technologist Practice Guide. And I chose this as a text because it was very accessible in language. It also had practical value, and it touched on some important concepts. It was one of the first books on PIT to actually make it to the shelves. It was published in 2020, actually self-published by Sid Harrell, and you could visit her website, download some optional chapters, and also interact with some of her other materials. Just broadly, the book has about 14 chapters from memory. It begins with what is civic tech, and when we define public interest technology and we look at it from the perspective of civil society, the notion of civic tech. Now, it doesn't mean that it's just tech for the people, but it also brings upon us an understanding of other stakeholders that might well be involved, namely the government, and how technology plays a part in serving everyday citizenry and more broadly, international citizens through various platforms, technologies, software, and other things as they emerge. Interestingly, Sid begins her book by talking about how complicated government in the US is to understand. And as the majority of our pitch students are still in the US, I'd like to focus on the US as the context. The federal level, the state level, the county level, city or town, and then this concept of civic tech in international roots. And you'll find that in refugee camps, in humanitarian aid. You'll find this notion in developing nations, even though we don't use those terms as in developing, but these are some of the places where you might see civic tech instituted. And typically it had to do with mainstream infrastructure that people required in terms of services, whether it was clean drinking water, basic facilities for housing, even sewage capacity in a neighborhood, and even the ability to actually use a telephone. I know in the 1990s, when I was working on projects with Nortel Networks and investigating the country of India as it deregulated through its state circles, we used to count the number of telephones per village. These were public payphones, and they were quite expensive to actually run, but many people required them to actually go about their business. And so looking at beyond, did PIT get invented yesterday or in 2020 or in 2016 when the Friedman Consulting Group came out and said there should be this term called technology in the public interest or public interest technology? And there are societies that have gone back 50 plus years, like the IEEE Society on the Social Implications of Technology, that was all about this field of interest, this notion that technology was for society, but also with society, and increasingly their outreach to humanitarian sort of global groups and also sustainable technology groups. We've got various conferences in the IEEE SSIT that incorporate the International Symposium of Technology and Society, an annual conference which is being held in Hong Kong this year. But also the Global Humanitarian Conference, GHTC, IST for Africa, run out of Africa, SASTech, which we've recently co-sponsored, and even the Norbert Wiener conference that looks at cybernetics and the automation and the impact of artificial intelligence and autonomous systems on a variety of application areas. Now, Sid does note on page 21 that we're navigating a nebulous space. That's because it's in its nascent stages of recognition, but increasingly people are being found with the term public interest technologist on their card. And these are people that have previously held a variety of posts, maybe responsible innovation managers, maybe humanitarian managers, even human rights commissioners or officers. The list goes on and on. Security personnel. And so it's great to see these consultants, these developers, these UX designers bursting onto the scene with this notion that goes beyond technological deployment, that all technologies must be built and developed using a human-centered approach, that it's not about implementation and multi-million-dollar contracts between vendors, service providers, and customers, but it's more about serving the needs of the people. And we go about design and responsibly innovate by asking people to participate in these design processes. We don't just get qualified personnel to go into a community and roll out a technology because they think it's the best, in the best interests of the community that is local. But in fact, what we're doing is we're requesting that people not only go through participatory design processes using human-centered approaches, but also co-design processes and even values by design. There's a whole lot of rhetoric here, and a lot of the problem of why Sid calls this nebulous is because they're at different levels of detail. And so public servants as stakeholders and colleagues, okay, how do we navigate that? That's on page 23. And public servants, for example, are committed to an agency. They represent a government agency, and that could be in Social Security, it could be in the Department of Housing, it could be in the Department of Telecommunications and Advancement. Whatever it is, stakeholders are both at once public servants, but also citizens themselves, and potentially wear other hats as well. And so how do we see public servants? In the past, there has been a feeling that public servants sort of rot the system, earn a comfy wage, and don't do anything. The old kind of analogy that's used there is often of council workers fixing a road and 5 people standing around holding lollipop signs while one is doing the work. And of course, that is a misnomer. One of the reasons that I think public servants need to garner a better profile is because the work they're doing affects everybody. And what we don't want is people shifting between departments to make it less accountable when they are in a given role. And so what we find now is new systems are being rolled out, people jump ship literally and try to go to other places because of this accountability issue. And we look at that in responsible innovation throughout the course. But also the public servants increasingly need to be empowered to make decisions. And until the point, often people in the technology space, and I can point to various agencies in Australia that have disempowered their public servants rather than empowered them to make decisions on behalf of the people or with the people. And so how we see one another, and many of you are public servants in this classroom, will be a topic of discussion that I'd like us to hit on. So that's a bit of a recap in chapter 1. I hope you appreciated that, and we'll be back.